Welcome, psychology students, to today's Explainer lecture. Let's just dive right in, because we're exploring a fascinating and frankly urgent shift in how we understand mental health. Today's core premise is this. Perfectionism is not just an individual personality trait. It's not just some clinical quirk. According to a really extensive new cross-temporal meta-analysis, perfectionism has actually become a culturally driven systemic pathogen. We are looking at a phenomenon where the society we live in acts like a giant petri dish, literally cultivating psychological distress. Here is the framework for today's lecture. 1. The rising perfectionism pandemic. 2. Internal strivings versus external concerns. 3. Horny, Han, and social pressure. 4. Neoliberalism and cultural pathways. 5. GDP, inequality, and meta-analysis. And finally, 6. Systemic solutions for systemic ills. Section 1. The rising perfectionism pandemic. Okay, before we get into the historical data, we need to quickly ground ourselves in the clinical terminology. In this explainer, we're tracking two primary dimensions of perfectionism. First is self-oriented perfectionism. This is the tendency to attach an irrational importance to perfection. It's this intense, internalized pressure where you hold yourself to completely unrealistic expectations. On the other hand, we have socially prescribed perfectionism. This is the belief that your social environment is excessively demanding. It's the feeling that others are constantly judging you and that you have to display total perfection just to secure basic approval. Keep these two distinct concepts in mind as we trace the trends. So, taking a look at a massive 35-year cross-temporal meta-analysis, we're talking over 82,000 college students here. Tracking perfectionistic strivings, which includes that self-oriented perfectionism we just defined, across the US, UK, and Canada, the data reveals a very clear, steady, linear upward trajectory. Starting from 1989 all the way up to 2024, young people are consistently becoming more and more demanding of themselves. But you have to contrast that steady climb with perfectionistic concerns, which encompasses socially prescribed perfectionism and intense doubts about actions. Instead of a linear path, we see an explosive, quadratic acceleration starting right around the early 2000s. The curve just bends sharply upward. Honestly, it is alarming to see this on a population level. And it is definitely no coincidence that this rapid acceleration perfectly aligns with the modern youth mental health crisis, a period heavily marked by rising anxiety, depression, and self-harm. Section 2. Internal strivings versus external concerns. Let's transition from the raw historical data to a micro-level examination of how these dimensions actually manifest within the individual psyche. The crucial point here is understanding the clinical difference in how these traits harm the patient. Perfectionistic strivings. Well, they often look really good on paper, right? They drive achievement behavior, but this completely belies a deep vulnerability to stress and performance difficulties. It carries a heavy risk of eating disorders and depressive symptoms. However, perfectionistic concerns are by far the most debilitating. This dimension is characterized by chronic self-doubt, a feeling of just never being good enough, terribly low self-esteem, and debilitating rumination. It has a massive correlation with severe psychopathology, including anxiety disorders and suicidality. If perfectionism is a public health crisis, this second category is exactly why. Section 3. Horny, Han, and social pressure. So, how do we bridge this gap between individual pathology and societal pressure? To understand this culturally, we turn to Karen Horney and Byung-Chul Han. Decades ago, Karen Horney wrote about tyrannical shoulds, which is the conflict between our actual selves and an idealized self, driven by negative prohibitions from society. You should do this, you cannot do that. In contrast, contemporary philosopher Byung-Chul Han describes the modern achievement society. He argues that today we're actually driven by positive compulsions, the endless coulds and cans. We engage in relentless self-exploitation, optimizing ourselves constantly, but we do it under the total illusion of freedom. We think we're choosing it. And this brings us to a really fascinating synthesis. The researchers of this meta-analysis argue that modern youth actually experience a combination of both. I must, therefore I can. It's almost a Faustian form of subjugation. Young people are highly aware that the perfectionistic demands placed upon them have external social origins. They know the game is rigged. Yet, against a backdrop of intense individualism, they have absolutely no choice but to internalize these demands as personal expectations. They deeply resent the societal demands, but paradoxically, they resent themselves for failing to meet them. Section 4. Neoliberalism and cultural pathways. Let's zoom out a bit further to objectively examine this cultural petri dish. The study points to the economic, political, and cultural movement of neoliberalism as the overarching driver here. They break this down into three distinct cultural pathways. First, individualism, a commodified selfhood where you literally treat yourself as a personal enterprise, managing your assets and liabilities, focusing heavily on material wealth and appearance. Second, meritocratic pressure, the logic that exceptional achievement is the sole measure of your innate personal worth, making anything less than absolute perfection feel like a personal deficiency. And third, controlling parenting. Parents become highly anxious about their children's competitive positioning. Just think of the extreme pressure surrounding elite college admissions or intense youth travel sports, and this leads to controlling styles that transmit these perfectionistic expectations across generations. What we're seeing is market values essentially overriding basic human needs for connection and autonomy. Section 5, GDP, inequality, and meta-analysis. Let's move over to the hard macroeconomic data. When the researchers tested macroeconomic covariates against the psychological data, they found a super fascinating divergence. Declining GDP per capita, which basically means economic stagnation, was associated with higher perfectionistic strivings. They call this economic vulnerability. When the economy stagnates, young people feel compelled to strive harder just to survive. On the other hand, a rising Gini index, which measures society's income inequality, is directly associated with steeper increases in perfectionistic concerns. They call this the inequality top-up. In a highly unequal society, mistakes carry catastrophic social and economic consequences, and that leads to hypervigilance, an intense fear of negative judgment, and chronic worry. Now, this next point is absolutely crucial. You might think, well, if everyone is perfectionistic now, maybe it's becoming less harmful. Actually, no. The data shows that the correlations between perfectionism and psychopathology, things like anxiety and depression, have remained completely stable over the last 35 years. Because the harm per person remains exactly the same, but the prevalence is accelerating rapidly, this translates to massive, multiplying population-level harm. The psychological toll is scaling up right along with the culture. Section 6, Systemic Solutions for Systemic Ills. Let's see how all this builds toward a necessary paradigm shift for the field of psychology. There's a quote directly from the study's public significance statement that says it perfectly. It emphasizes that tackling the youth mental health crisis should involve both individual efforts and a focus on the cultural and economic factors fostering perfectionism. Basically, while individual clinical treatments are necessary, they're ultimately insufficient on their own. We're out here trying to treat individual symptoms while totally ignoring the fact that the structural, economic, and cultural environment is the primary driver of the pathology. We simply can't medicate or therapy our way out of a problem that is baked into the macroeconomic structure. Therefore, the study points to some really required institutional interventions. To actually reduce the perfectionistic pressure placed on younger generations, we have to look at macroeconomic reforms. And this isn't just about tweaking a few policies. It means fundamentally addressing cultural hyper-individualism. It means rebuilding our economies to emphasize shared prosperity rather than brutal winner-takes-all outcomes. We have to actively reduce the relentless meritocratic sorting, sifting, and ranking that completely dominates our education systems and our workplaces. Ultimately, it requires alleviating the structural economic pressures of scarcity and inequality that make young people feel like a single mistake is going to completely ruin their lives. I want to leave you with a final, pretty provocative thought. As future clinicians, you are going to be on the front lines of this crisis. When a student sits in your office suffering from severe, socially prescribed perfectionism, terrified of failure, totally exhausted by the relentless demand to optimize themselves, how can we effectively treat that individual when society itself is the source of the pathology? It's a profound challenge, for sure, but by understanding these macroeconomic and cultural roots, you are already so much better equipped to help them navigate it. Thank you for joining me for this explainer lecture, and keep questioning the systems around you.